Hey everyone, how's it going? Welcome back to my channel, or if you're new here, welcome for the first time. Today we will be discussing discrimination against Jewish and Muslim students in multiple universities in the wake of the ongoing Israel-Gaza war and the lack of transparency from their administrative offices when confronted about their policies on dealing with that discrimination on campus. Last December, the presidents of Harvard, the University of Pennsylvania, and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology were called to testify at a hearing at the House Education and Workforce Committee where they were asked by Republican Representative Elise Stefanik if calling for the genocide of Jews constitutes a violation of their bullying and harassment policies. It should be as clear as a polished mirror that the answer is yes, because calling for the extermination of an entire group of people shouldn't be tolerated anywhere. A coordinated ambush carried out by the Hamas had killed 1,200 people, and 250 more of them have been taken hostage. Families were separated by the attack, and nobody could rely on the police to protect them because their hands were full trying to combat a well-planned operation that Egypt allegedly tried to warn Israel about. Some hostages have since been released, but 132 of them are still forced to endure cruel treatment, never knowing when they'd walk free. A United Nations report published by Pramila Patten on March 4th described instances where imprisoned young women were brutally SA'd and killed by their captors. Many Jewish American students, including those that were present at the hearing, that have witnessed protesters on campus showing support for Gaza are terrified that the atrocities that the Hamas have perpetrated on civilians and their loved ones have fallen on deaf ears. They are understandably scared to death by the terrorist attacks. As a result, they do not feel safe in their own communities, and I sympathize with how awful that is to them. Neither president of the universities gave a clear answer to Mrs. Stefanik's question and only answered it does depending on the context, which can be looked at as irresolute and indecisive when taken out of context. See what I did there? To be fair, I would argue that these presidents might be saying that calling for genocide and not acting on it is protected by freedom of speech, but it's not without its repercussions, and it certainly should not extend to that level of bullying. It didn't help matters that Elizabeth McGill was smiling when giving her response and that she answered, when that speech becomes conduct, it can be harassment, because it sounded like she wasn't taking the gravity of the issue that seriously. I can understand why Mrs. Stefanik didn't react well to that answer. Speech can hurt just as much as, sometimes more than, the act itself. Dr. Gay also elaborated on Harvard stepping in to take disciplinary action only when bigoted beliefs lead to bullying and harassment, but it still didn't diminish Mrs. Stefanik's concerns.
The answer is yes. And Dr. Gay, at Harvard, does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Harvard's rules of bullying and harassment, yes or no?
It can be, depending on the context.
What's the context?
Targeted as an individual, at an individual.
It's targeted at Jewish students, Jewish individuals. Do you understand your testimony is dehumanizing them? Do you understand that dehumanization is part of anti-Semitism? I will ask you one more time. Does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Harvard's rules of bullying and harassment, yes or no?
Anti-Semitic rhetoric.
And is it anti-Semitic rhetoric?
Anti-Semitic rhetoric when it crosses into conduct that amounts to bullying, harassment, intimidation, that is actionable conduct, and we do take action.
So the answer is yes, that calling for the genocide of Jews violates Harvard Code of Conduct, correct?
Again, it depends on the context.
It does not depend on the context. The answer is yes, and this is why you should resign. These are unacceptable answers across the board.
Hate speech and a call for genocide of not just Jews, but Muslims too, should be taken as a warning that it could escalate to violence if the Dean of Student Affairs, a residential assistant, and the campus police don't step in. Whether or not the offending individuals were joking is not important because it can still be alienating to a student of either ethnicity. The Workforce Committee's priority for the hearing was primarily about tackling anti-Semitism, but the rise of Islamophobia on school grounds goes hand in hand with the war, and it's disheartening that the representatives on the committee haven't said a word about it. Virginia Fox, another Republican member of the House of Representatives and the chair of the Workforce Committee, stressed that the students that were present at the hearing gave statements that they did not feel safe due to the viewpoints expressed by their fellow peers and professors that are angry with Israel. Their concerns and fears are valid. I support the right to feel safe attending college, but the way Fox has described protester demands to free Gaza from Israeli occupation as defending terrorism is an over-the-top choice of words that leaves a bad taste in my mouth because I don't think that is what they're all doing. She then proceeded to ask the three presidents if Israel has the right to exist as a Jewish state, and they all answered yes. The Jewish community affected by the attack are innocent people too. They share biblical soil with their Palestinian neighbors, yet it is a fact that keeps slipping our minds. I took an Arab culture through film class during my last semester in college, and I have close friends from Iran and Pakistan whose hearts go out to Gaza. I can say that while the Jewish population in Israel have the right to live there, it does not exempt its government from stripping basic human rights from dispatched civilians. The hearing starts off with Virginia Fox giving a statement about the Jewish students at these universities that have become fearful for their safety due to the spike in anti-Semitism on campus, and the presidents that were summoned to the hearing were given a chance to take a stand against it. Although it's great in hindsight that the committee is taking this seriously and that some action was taken at these universities, not every student and professor that disagrees with Israel's politics hate Jewish people. To state that they do is such an oversimplified interpretation of the protest that it disregards the fact that these same politicians are ignoring the university's Muslim students and the affairs surrounding the war reported by journalists and relief workers that have visited civilians dispatched by the fighting.
Thank you. Today, each of you will have a chance to answer to and atone for the many specific instances of vitriolic, hate-filled anti-Semitism on your respective campuses that have denied students the safe learning environment they are due. As you confront our questions in this hearing, remember you're not speaking to us, but to the students on your campus who have been threatened and assaulted and who look to you to protect them. Several of those students are with us in this room, including Jonathan Frieden, who's the president of Alliance for Israel and a Harvard Law student. Eyal Yacobi, who's a student at UPenn. Talia Khan, who is the president of MIT Israel Alliance and an MIT graduate student. Bella Ingber, who is co-president of NYU Students Supporting Israel and a junior at New York University. Israel Ingber, who is expected to start at the University of Chicago in the fall after taking a gap year to study in Israel after being sent home right before the atrocities of October 7th. Maya Kufer, who is a freshman at UPenn, and Liam Kriez, who is an American-Israeli sophomore at UPenn. We have a short video that we'll play now that shows what these students are facing.
It looks like the video the committee had played is just a few compiled clips of student-led protests across the universities. It doesn't provide much context to support what their peers have been feeling. The sight alone might instill fear, but the lack of specific incidents where bullying had transpired seems suspicious. If the word antifada causes that reaction, do not panic. Like many phrases of Arabic origin, such as Alkahlout, it is widely misunderstood due to its use by terrorist organizations. Antifada translates to shake off or dust off, and in these videos, the protesters have used it to support a movement against a violent oppressor. It didn't used to have that connotation until the Iraqi Intifada in 1952, but the connection between overthrowing a tyrannical leader and shaking dust off your body has caused the war to be associated with a fight for freedom, a right that Gizan civilians are deprived of. Jewish American students do have good reason to interpret "Long Live the Intifada" as a call for genocide because of the bloodshed against Israeli civilians linked to the Second Intifada, but it's an irrational assumption to make on a broader scale because most of the protests in the videos were peaceful. That might be why the university's presidents, particularly Dr. Gay, answered, "It can be bullying and harassment depending on the context." I emphasize more with her if that's the explanation for her reluctance to explicitly respond yes or no to Elise Stefanik's question, but it still was an insufficient answer. She might have asked that question to have a gotcha moment to catch the presidents off guard and continue to normalize sentiments that drives Americans to fear and hate their Muslim peers. If we're discussing Jewish members of the university's communities, like a student from UPenn that was terrified to go to the library, students that were sent vile messages on their social media pages and or when they were met with hostility in person, now that would be a violation of the school's bullying and harassment policies.
I want to do something which I rarely do, quote the Senate Majority Leader from New York, Chuck Schumer. On Wednesday, he took to the Senate floor to deliver an address on anti-Semitism, stating, "Many of the people who express these sentiments in America aren't neo-Nazis or card-carrying Klan members or Islamist extremists. They're in many cases people that most liberal Jewish Americans felt previously were their ideological fellow travelers. Not long ago, many of us marched together for black and brown lives." End of quote. You see, this speech by the most powerful elected Jewish politician in America was addressed to many on his left flank. He questioned how these elements of the left, which pride themselves on diversity and inclusion, could be responsible for fomenting such hatred toward liberal Jewish Americans. I quote Majority Leader Schumer to you, Presidents Gay, McGill, and Kornbluth, because I understand that speech to be a sort of reckoning for the Jewish identity with the radical left. Yet for 40 minutes, he fails to use the word university a single time. However, after the events of the past 2 months, it's clear that rabid anti-Semitism and the university are two ideas that cannot be cleaved from one another. A prime example of this ideology at work is at Harvard, where classes are taught such as DP 385, Race and Racism in the Making of the United States as a Global Power. The Harvard Global Health Institute hosts seminars such as, quote, Scientific Racism and Anti-Racism, History and Recent Perspectives. Even the Harvard Divinity School has a page devoted to, quote, social and racial justice.
This is the problem I have with Virginia's opening statement. The committee has made the hearing exclusively a DEI issue when there are multiple causes of the rise of anti-Semitism at the 3 university campuses. I knew there was an ulterior motive for questioning the 3 presidents. My suspicions were supported by the part of the hearing when Glenn Grothman told Dr. Gay that during the 2016 presidential election, 2% of Harvard's faculty viewed Donald Trump as a virtuous person, and in 2020, the Crimson reported that only 1% of the student body had voted for him. Then he proceeded to ask her if it worries her that the school lacks ideological diversity, as if he expected Trump supporters to have a bigger presence on campus, and if that's one of the reasons why anti-Semitism is becoming a bigger problem.
Just playing around here a little bit on the internet, in 2016 they found about 2% of the faculty of Harvard were viewed President Trump, I think, as okay or good. And I think in the 2020 election, the Crimson, your local paper there, found 1% of the students voting for Donald Trump, which, given that nationwide is about 50-50, was kind of shocking. Does it concern you at all that you apparently have a great deal, a lack of ideological diversity at Harvard? And do you think that atmosphere is maybe one of the reasons why there seems to be such an outbreak of anti-Semitism at your institution?
Is that question for me?
That's the question for you, yeah. And I'll ask you, what are you going to do about it? Do you think it's a concern?
So we strive to have as diverse a faculty as we can, because we want to make sure that we are sampling from the broadest pool of talent available in the world. That's how we ensure academic excellence.
Dr. Gay, again, didn't give a direct yes or no answer and instead said that when considering potential applicants to join the faculty, Harvard analyzes a variety of talent that they have to determine if they're qualified to adequately encourage future lawyers, artists, authors, doctors, and scientists to challenge their values and recognize their own implicit biases. These include religious and political upbringings that may have been instrumental in developing these biases. Going to college based on my experience taking traditional art classes and interacting with classmates whose backgrounds differ from my own is coming to the realization that it's perfectly okay not to be okay.
From what I read here, maybe they're making stuff up, but I don't think they're making it up. We said 2% of your faculty viewed Donald Trump as something other poor in 2016, and after 4 years of working for diversity, 1% voted for him. Now, I know all sorts of good people who don't like President Trump, but I'm just saying, when you compare the way people think at your campus compared to America as a whole, if there's one thing you are, it's not diverse, right? Well, do you consider that a problem, or the numbers I gave you?
So, Congressman, I can't speak to the specific data that you are referring to. What I can say is that at Harvard, we try to create as much space as possible for a wide range of views and perspectives, because we believe that allows for a thriving academic community.
How in the world is that even possible? And that you're trying to do that? Do you really feel that your faculty are ideologically diverse?
That's not Harvard lacking diversity. That's just Mr. Grothman bellyaching that the institution's community isn't going along with Donald Trump's ideals. Even if they have reason to support him and his re-election campaign, it wouldn't automatically cost them their jobs. It is unlawful to refuse to hire someone whose political beliefs don't match their employers. In the same way, it's ludicrous to refuse service to someone whose beliefs don't align with yours, like when this person is ordering at a restaurant. But beliefs that involve viewing minorities as undeserving of basic needs, denying them employment opportunities, and should be looked at with disgust don't belong in any institution for education and research. You can, by all means, use my argument against me by telling me in the comments, these students are calling for the genocide of Jews. What the hell is wrong with you? But Time magazine reported that the primary causes of rampant anti-Semitism ranges from the spread of white supremacy in the United States to xenophobia that stemmed from the Great Replacement conspiracy theory endorsed by Fox News and social media sites that pay lip service to its hate speech policies. Twitter, as many of you may have wagered if you've been subscribed to my channel for quite some time, is one of them. Anti-Semites, transphobes, homophobes, and predators in sheep's clothing have made the platform their home. According to The Box and the BBC, Elon Musk has built a reputation of enabling that hate speech by interacting with his accounts and has posted a few anti-Semitic tweets of his own. One includes his engagement with a racist tweet that wrongfully accused Jewish communities of encouraging minority groups to immigrate to Western countries to drive their white populations to extinction. Elon's first reply was, and I quote, "You have said the actual truth." The endorsement of the Great Replacement has driven gullible American citizens to blindly believe that the Jewish population is plotting to kill them, and it's possible some of the students viewing anti-Semitism toward their peers have partly caved into that conspiracy out of fear or possibly ignorance. Mr. Grothman, Mrs. Stefanik, and Mrs. Fox did not look at the connection between the spiking anti-Semitism and Trump-influenced nationalism in the U.S. Elon's lenient handling of hate speech on Twitter has driven a female network engineer to risk suspension and scorn him for making the technology industry a cesspit of misogyny. She profoundly argued that DEI is beneficial for companies because its programs exist to protect diverse people from discrimination when they submit their resumes and assimilate into the workplace. Some of her initial tweets have tragically since been deleted, but her courage to take that stand was inspirational. These details have made this issue a lot more complicated than the committee made it out to be. The paragraphs of Virginia Fox's opening statement I read through are indicators that conservative activists involved are using the university's failure to adequately protect Jewish members of their community to stoke division, paint Dr. Gay as a scapegoat, and prevent students from uncovering and raising awareness of how the Israeli military is bent on wiping Giza off the map in the name of fighting against the Hamas. But before I get into the human rights violations that have transpired and the protests that have spread to other prestigious universities across the U.S. as the genocide worstens, I'd like to first discuss what happened to Dr. Gay since the disastrous hearing with the Workforce Committee, because that in of itself has caused professors and students in marginalized groups at Harvard to fear that the Republican Party is interfering with the school's affairs. As calls for Dr. Gay's resignation grew louder, so did skepticism of her academic integrity. Rising conservative activist Christopher Rofo and another journalist have launched an aggressive, preconceived campaign that accused her of plagiarizing several scholars in her research. If you're unsure of who Chris is, he is a new College of Florida trustee that became popular for his opposition of critical race theory and discussion of LGBT+ topics in classrooms, of course. A book he had written and published last July, America's Cultural Revolution, perpetuates the theory that DEI is a scheme that's part of an elaborate conspiracy that the wealthy, liberal elite have taken over universities in the United States and are secretly plotting a cultural revolution to overthrow the government. Chris's unhinged arguments that it is the right solemn duty to rid institutions of inclusivity like it's a virus are similar to ideals that excuse anti-Semitism, its advocacy to protect Jewish students from bullying but gloss over this vital detail of the problem doesn't seem cognate. An early example of anti-Semitism that mirrors Christopher Rofo's ire toward critical race theory was back when the Roman Empire dominated Europe. The father of a friend of mine recently regaled me with a story that its people, and sometimes its politicians, constantly indulged themselves, and they were angry at their Jewish neighbors because they were wealthier than they were. It didn't have anything to do with their religion and their ethnicity. They just happened to be more responsible with their money, and they are well-educated members of the empire society. Instead of reflecting on their impulsive spending, the Romans were convinced that the Jewish population was plotting to conquer the world. This form of scapegoating subjected them to merciless acts of violence, and during the reign of Claudius, they were banished from the empire. Likewise, teachers in Florida's secondary schools nowadays face dismissal and backlash from fearful parents for promoting representation of a marginalized group in their classrooms, and it could happen in the northern states if teachers employed in their schools cease to speak out. Governor Ron DeSantis has not stopped at the secondary schools. Earlier in March, the University of Florida pulled its entire DEI department when spending public funds on political and social activism became prohibited. In a state where you can't say gay and teachers risk prosecution for providing support for their LGBT+ students, this regression is no surprise. Chris's reasoning to put pressure on Dr. Gay to resign was made obvious in an interview with Ian Ward. He wasn't trying to hold her accountable for any alleged plagiarism, but instead used her lackluster answers at the hearing to deem her incompetent and set a precedent for other universities to disband their DEI programs, essentially undermining her credentials. A Harvard administrator that posted in the H-Bomber Guy subreddit about the somber atmosphere on campus stressed that prior to her appointment as president, Dr. Gay served as the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences and has taught in higher education for much of her career. Thanks to Chris's connections to the mainstream media, his close relationships with Harvard's most affluent donors that threatened to pull their funding, and an onslaught of racially motivated targeted harassment directed at Dr. Gay, he succeeded in his campaign. The day after New Year's, she caved in and announced her resignation in a letter she penned to the school's community. She had made history as its first black female president, and her appointment last July made her a role model to African-American college women studying to be trailblazers in their respective fields. Students like Eden Gudahan anticipated that the obstacles Dr. Gay might overcome would be more Herculean than her predecessors, but to see her lead the institution made her feel visible. She has given black students hope that they can achieve anything, and the right-wing campaign that Chris Wolfio led advocated to have that gone. When the plagiarism allegations were brought to the Board of Trustees' attention, they weren't initially too concerned. Regardless, they launched an investigation at Dr. Gay's request, and a group of political scientists conducted an independent review. They found that while her essays contained a few improper citations, they weren't serious enough to violate Harvard's research misconduct policy. The school decided not to sanction her. Dr. Gay additionally took responsibility and requested corrections to be made to her research, but the Republican-led Workforce Committee and media outlets involved in Chris's campaign did not let the situation rest. Harvard's board and much of its students and faculty stood with their president, but negative mainstream coverage and a possible loss of donors was starting to get to them. On the day Dr. Gay resigned from her post, NBC News reached out to student Alex Burnett and history professor Ellison Frank Johnson and asked them what their reactions were to the announcement.
Gay's resignation leaving the campus divided.
I'm glad that, it seems like we're moving in a direction where Harvard might begin to repair its public image.
I was flabbergasted. I was more than surprised. I was shocked. I don't think she was really given a chance from the start.
I agree with both of the responses from a PR standpoint. Some students that were disgruntled with Dr. Gay's answers at the hearing and felt she had not done enough to crack down on the increase of bullying and harassment following the ambush on October 7th welcomed her decision to step down, and it appeased angry donors. This allowed Harvard to salvage what was left of its reputation. The school has appointed health economist Alan Garber as its interim president, and according to the insider that posted on Reddit, he himself is a respected senior administrator, but the optics are still sour. When my father and my sister, an associate director at a liberal arts college, told each other that Dr. Gay had a target placed on her back as a leader in a private Ivy League university, they were right. Other students and faculty were in despair that Dr. Gay wasn't treated fairly during the hearing, as well as the weeks that followed, and agreed that marginalized individuals in high positions of authority are less likely to be protected from targeted harassment in comparison to their cisgender Caucasian male colleagues. Gudahan and Amy Howard, a Harvard student majoring in government and African American studies, both said that they felt the school hasn't done enough to protect Dr. Gay from racially motivated targeted harassment instigated by the campaign to get her kicked out. If her resignation was truly over her alleged plagiarism, she wouldn't have been permitted to return to her previous post as a tenured professor. This means Professor Johnson's comment to NBC bore more weight to how dire the situation has been. While the repercussions did give Harvard a minuscule chance to mend its relationship with the Workforce Committee, in the long run, as we've witnessed from the spring semester, it did absolutely nothing to curb anti-Semitism and Islamophobia on campus. The anti-Israeli protests grew passionate and louder to the point where participants camped out on school grounds, and police were called in an attempt to put a stop to them. The paragraphs of Virginia Fox's opening statement from the paragraphs I read on a PDF file the committee published are indicators that conservative activists involved with Christopher Rufio's campaign are using the university's failure to adequately protect Jewish members of their community to attack their DEI programs, use Dr. Gay's resignation to justify their advocacy to get it banned, and prevent students from uncovering and raising awareness of how exactly the Israeli government has committed multiple human rights violations. I'm not pulling your leg. The United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights had received intelligence last February that Palestinian women and girls were intentionally executed by Israeli forces while they fled with their families. Israel's retaliatory assault on Gaza has claimed 29,000 lives and had rendered 80% of its population homeless, including Mohammed, a friend I met on Reddit whose home was destroyed in an airstrike. He has set up a GoFundMe to raise money for necessities needed to get him and his family through living in a temporary shelter and work towards rebuilding their home. Sadly, he cannot do that without our aid. Please help Mohammed however you can by donating through the link that I'll leave in the description, but only do so if you can afford it. I've done my part by donating $20 before I started recording this video. Otherwise, you can spread the word by sharing the link by posting it on your social media feeds. As I usually say at work whenever we're raising money for charity, every penny helps. Many dispatched families in Giza are currently facing similar, if not worse, conditions and fears of the Israeli military targeting them. They already have within the course of several months. The United Nations additionally reported that 1.1 million Palestinian lives are being condemned to starvation due to a potential famine that could strike Giza. 2 months ago, Israel launched a raid into Rafah in the hope of combating the Hamas inside, though it meant that humanitarian workers could not enter to deliver supplies to the population because the troops have closed off the city's Egyptian border. No less than a week before troops entered that part of southern Giza, Israel's military carried out an airstrike that killed 27 people, and among the casualties were mostly women and children. Within the 8 months that were spent at war with the Hamas, more civilians in Giza have been killed than civilians in Israel. The U.S. right-wing activists' deliberate lack of awareness of these statistics is deafening. Yes, I am aware that Israeli civilians have died since October 7th and that the Hamas are still holding innocents captive. My heart goes out to them and I pray that they'll all be rescued, but my sympathy for them and my sympathy for Gizan civilians that are missing food because the Israeli government will not help them are not mutually exclusive. The war affects both groups of people and their blood is in our hands. I hate that the Workforce Committee, business investors, and yes, even a friend have made this binary that condemning the Israeli government's acts of violence is anti-Semitic. It is hardly accurate and it certainly doesn't speak for the entire Jewish population. Even before the Hamas attacked that October, the governments of nations in the Middle East has perceived the establishment of a Jewish nation as an occupation. I'm going to be expecting frenzied, fear-mongering arguments in the comments that in Israel, the LGBT+ community is safe and the queer community, coupled with student protesters in universities like Harvard, is supporting terrorism by joining in on calls to demand a ceasefire. First of all, Israel does not recognize same-sex marriage, and the LGBT+ community living in Giza do not have that protection the nation's government claims to offer. Second of all, exclaiming to me that I support terrorism means you haven't been paying attention to stories where Israeli troops have murdered Gizan youth during their assault. A freelancer tweeted that his 20-year-old cousin, for instance, was fatally shot while fetching water for his family, and a relative couldn't retrieve his body in case she'd met the same fate he did. Since November 16th last year, her whereabouts have been unclear. You're resorting to the same rhetoric that Adolf Hitler used to turn his supporters against their Jewish neighbors, and the same rhetoric George W. Bush used to guilt-trip American citizens into endorsing the Iraqi war. Speaking of, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and several leaders of the Hamas will likely face arrest warrants for war crimes and crimes against humanity from the International Criminal Court. Netanyahu responded by branding the chief prosecutor as one of the greatest anti-Semites of all the time, and comparing him to judges in Nazi Germany that have allowed the Holocaust to happen. Oh, for Pete's sake. His reaction is insensitive to survivors of the Holocaust that endured similar circumstances in concentration camps. It's not anti-Semitic to hold a world leader responsible for circumventing humanitarian law, such as purposely letting civilians starve to death in territory he believes is undeserving of statehood. Most prisoners that died in the camps like Bergen-Belsen went for days without meals, causing them to be more vulnerable to disease, a reality that Gizan civilians continue to face. The similarities makes Netanyahu's response to being threatened with an arrest warrant by the ICC clearly tone deaf. These are the reasons why Lorde canceled a concert she was going to perform at Tel Aviv in 2017. She knew her fans living in Israel would be disappointed by the news, and some public figures like Roseanne Barr are more than thrilled to label her a bigot. But she's well aware that the Israeli government would get a cut had she decided to perform with the persecution of Gizan lives on her conscience. Lorde values human life, and along with her honesty, it's what I respect about her. When the current war in Giza broke out, Lorde shared several stories on Instagram where she once more shows solitude for Palestine. In one of them, she praises Nemahsis' cover of Team, one of her songs from her debut album, for its use in this dire conflict reminded her of why she wanted to pursue a career in music. Lorde had stated, like any other art medium, it can express more than words can muster, and that brought me back to why I enjoyed her music. She's always brutally honest about how she views the world from the eyes of an artist that catapulted into fame as an adolescent. I'll play Nemahsis' cover if it doesn't get copyrighted because the video contains a phenomenal compilation of photos in Giza before and after the war began, and it amplifies the singer's interpretation of Teen.
We live in cities you'll never see on screen. Not very pretty, but we sure know how to run things. Living in ruins of the palace within our dreams. And you know, we're on each other's teams. I'm kinda over getting told to throw my hands up in the air. So there.
Roseanne, on the other hand, doesn't give a damn about human life. She posted a racist tweet directed at Valerie Jeanette, who served former President Obama, and that got her rebooted self-titled sitcom canceled. I remember that sometime before the show premiered, a Muslim friend that I met on Twitter tweeted about his despair that it was greenlit. He was hit with an avalanche of Islamophobic replies and disgusting messages containing racist comics from her fanbase. Many of them said that they were going to watch her show anyway and were more than delighted to lightheartedly attribute his ethnicity to 9/11 in the hope of aggravating him. Scrolling through these replies made me so angry to learn that garbage people live on this planet. When the news broke that Roseanne got kicked out of her own show, I looked back on that incident and gave myself a smirk. Seeing my friend be given that kind of closure strengthened my belief that what goes around does come around. So yeah, Roseanne's the actual bigot. The belief to establish and protect a Jewish nation is virtuous in of itself because the Jewish community deserves to have a home to be safe in. But like any other faith or ideology, Zionism is prone to corruption and it can lead to the demonization of another group of people. It is a tricky situation because while some public figures are thinking of their loved ones and the Jewish community living in Israel, it's hard to do so in a way that trivializes or ignores the oppression Gizans face every day. The key to understanding the genocide and what we can do to help is brushing on how it began. Sadly, the removal of critical race theory at any grade level, be it elementary school or in college, will prevent students from getting a grasp of why their classmates are protesting the war. The father of a friend of mine that regaled me with the possible origin of anti-Semitism that took place in the Roman Empire also told me that a few participants in these rallies have no idea why they're there, and that's concerning. Basically, the students protesting at the universities are demanding that the institutions cut off financial ties with Israel and sever the relationships with organizations that endorse it because while they, along with the U.S. government, have no control over another country's affairs, they can impose sanctions on them like what they did to Russia when they first invaded Ukraine. This would allow more humanitarian aid workers to enter the war-torn Giza Strip to deliver food and medicine to the civilians through another route, besides the temporary pier the U.S. military constructed. The protests at these schools were peaceful and the student participants were unarmed. However, in April, some instances of vandalism and risks to public safety at Columbia University have prompted it to call the police. It resulted in 108 students, including Representative Ilhan Omar's daughter, getting arrested and charged with trespassing. Undeniably, the tension has gotten so dangerous and volatile that it has joined a few other universities in canceling their main graduation ceremonies. Those taken into police custody did not resist and were cooperative during questioning, according to New York City Police Department Commissioner Edward Caban. However, their arrests have instigated arguments that the protesters' First Amendment rights were not protected. Some have argued that those that set up tents on campus grounds didn't count because the universities are not public spaces and students that left their classes reportedly faced harassment. While I don't condone disruptive behavior and vandalism for that matter, please don't do that, I don't believe the protesters supporting Giza are being treated fairly either, and they certainly happen in spaces on social media that are openly racist toward the U.S.'s Muslim population.
Have you seen anti-Muslim protests on campus? I have seen, we have had pro-Israeli demonstrations on campus.
No.
But
just
not,
a protest that was
not,
against Muslims.
No, I have
you
not
seen one against Arabs?
No, I have not.
Have you seen one against Palestinians?
No, I have not.
Have you seen one against Jewish people? Have you seen a protest saying we are against Jewish people?
No, I have seen.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. There has been a rise in targeting and harassment against anti-war protesters because it's been pro-war and anti-war protesters is what it seems like, correct?
Correct. There has been.
Thank you. Activists on campus, including Jewish students, Black and Brown, Arab and Muslim students. How many of the organizations that were canceled in Colombia involved Jewish students?
One of the organizations is called Jewish Voices for Peace.
Yes. And encompassed of Jewish students?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. There's been a recent attack on the democratic rights of students across the country. I was appalled to learn that in April, Colombia suspended and evicted 6 students for their involvement in the pro-Palestinian panel event on campus.
Representative Omar shared this sentiment when, in light of the suspension of 6 students from Colombia for failing to cooperate with investigators, she commented that there has been a recent attack on the democratic rights of students across the country. At a separate hearing with the Workforce Committee in April, she questioned the university's president, Nemahsis Shafik, on if she has seen protests against students of Middle Eastern descent and what the administration has done about the harassment toward not just Jewish students, but Muslim students and those that participated in anti-war protests. It was a breath of fresh air to watch because while most of her fellow committee members were preoccupied with outlawing freedom of speech by using their fight against anti-Semitism as a red herring, Representative Omar was concerned for the safety of every student. Her questions for President Shafik were fair, and she did not shy away from her disgust when she brought up the suspensions as well as allegations that the investigators that were hired had sent threatening messages to leaders of the organizations advocating against the war. President Shafik assured Representative Omar that individuals in these organizations inciting violence compelled the administration to request their involvement, but the politician and anti-war protesters were not convinced because they believed the investigators had intentionally gone after students that supported Giza. Additionally, other participants received little support back in January when they were assaulted with what appeared to be a stink bomb and were left hospitalized. President Shafik stated that the investigation regarding the assault is ongoing and told Representative Omar that the victims were contacted by the university in a timely manner, but she requested a written answer to that question to confirm this detail to ease her concerns. At any rate, for another prestigious private university like Harvard, convincing an academic administration to cut off ties with organizations associated with Israel is not a simple mission to accomplish. The most affluent donors and students actively involved in alliance groups for Israel are sympathetic with its government, and any attempt to sever these relationships would be met with brutal retribution. These students would leave the school under the impression they won't be safe and it lose its funding, effectively closing it down. Harvard University's commencement ceremony was carried out as planned, but 13 students that participated in the protest were banned from attending. This decision pissed off Speaker Shruti Kumar, and I don't blame her for feeling outraged. She took to the stage and ripped the university to pieces for its bias against her peers when enforcing disciplinary action related to the protests. Shruti voiced her outrage in a way that was eloquent and profound. Her unscripted speech was so empowering that I was moved when I first listened to it.
This semester, our freedom of speech and our expressions of solidarity became punishable. Leaving our graduations uncertain. As I stand before you today, I must take a moment to recognize my peers. The 13 undergraduates in the class of 2024 who will not graduate today. I am deeply disappointed by the intolerance for freedom of speech and the right to civil disobedience on campus. Over 1,500 students had petitioned. Nearly 500 staff and faculty had spoken up, all overwhelmingly against the unprecedented sanctions. As an American and as a Harvard graduate, for me, what is happening on campus is about liberty. This is about civil rights and upholding democratic principles. The students had spoken. The faculty had spoken. Harvard, do you hear us? Harvard, do you hear us?
More than 1,000 students graduating exited the ceremony in defiance. When Harvard's community expressed regret that Dr. Claudine had resigned, they anticipated that the circumstances would only get worse from here, and just as she was unprotected, now so were the students and faculty she had previously served in her post. As much as Harvard is hailed as a beacon of enlightenment and for being the alumni mater for the U.S.'s top attorneys, authors, scientists, and politicians, the scrutiny it's been under by the Republican-run Workforce Committee and anti-war activists such as Nobel Peace Prize winner Maria Russell warning it not to stifle the protest has placed it in a lose-lose situation. Meanwhile, the University of Texas in Austin made international headlines by doing just that, and that has led to physical altercations with law enforcement at protests with enormous turnouts. The ACLU has issued warnings to participants to exercise the right to remain silent when questioned by an officer and remain calm. Protesters with student visas are at greater risk of facing harsher punishments if the authorities deem their activities as quote-unquote domestic terrorism. It's funny because they're protesting terrorism, and a lot of the time, marginalized groups aren't treated as fairly by the police when compared to their more privileged peers. What's interesting about the unnecessary arrest at UT Austin is that it receives funding from the state. However, Texas is governed by an idiot. On May 16th, he pardoned a convict that murdered a Black Lives Matter protester in 2020 by citing a draconian stand-your-ground self-defense law. It sets a precedent for the right wing that if the government shares their religious and political beliefs, they can commit a hate crime and be let off with a pat on the shoulder. Eliminating DEI programs in Texas will eventually allow similar offenses to be forgiven under state law. Furthermore, what's hypocritical about conservative users and politicians that praise the police for protecting and serving their communities by charging the students with trespassing is that they decry them for doing exactly that by charging the participants in the January 6th riot at the U.S. Capitol for sedition. I hated it when I saw some comments in that post state, well, go protest somewhere else. Some people just want to get an education. When if it weren't for protests led by Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks in locations where the oppression is happening, our schools and businesses would still be segregated. Their idea of being educated is teaching college students to stick to the status quo and avoid books with quote-unquote woke propaganda that could encourage them to break free of their unconscious biases and embrace diversity in their everyday lives. Houston Public Media has reported that the protests at the school were mostly peaceful, two words that right-wing users love to put in air quotes whenever tension arises with law enforcement and a handful of bad apples inflict an act of violence while they casually ignore the facet that they don't speak for their fellow protesters nor the cause. Two Jewish students interviewed by Fox News were told by the more impassioned, angrier protesters to go back to Germany and were clearly targeted because of their heritage and their solidarity with Israel. Let me make one thing clear. Regardless of who and what cause you support, telling someone to go back to whatever country they're from is racist and it's un-American. The United States is founded and built by immigrants, so this phrasing literally goes against the cornerstone of this nation. Speaking of acts that are un-American, last April, a Muslim student that goes to UT Austin was on his way back to campus from a mosque when he and his friend were cornered by three men that mocked them by rudely mimicking Islamic phrases before they proceeded to punch him. A similar racially motivated assault had taken place a couple months earlier on February 4th, when a student of Palestinian descent was stabbed in the chest on his way back from an anti-genocide demonstration at the state capitol. The perpetrator, who was afterwards charged with both aggravated assault with a deadly weapon and a hate crime, additionally shouted Islamophobic slurs at him and two other peers. It's convenient that the governor and conservative media outlets like Fox News swept these attacks under the rug. A politician wielding authority over a state government that's willing to trade civil rights for entitlement to own a gun should be the last person to condemn anti-Semitism because, from how I see it, they are using this highly sensitive issue to mask their own bigotry. Long story short, comments like "Go protest somewhere else," Governor Abbott's tweets denouncing all of the protesters as criminals by default, and inevitably similar comments on this video are the right wing's way of saying that children should be seen and not heard. It's a no-brainer that this UT Austin student on Reddit was terrified to go to a protest on campus on the off chance they would walk away in handcuffs and get suspended. Like the students that are vocalizing their anger toward their schools that haven't stopped associating with organizations that are loyal to Israel, former President Trump's supporters had every right to vocalize their disappointment that their grand ruler has lost a fair election. In both situations, the police could not tell who is and isn't a threat. Even if a suspect knows in their heart that they didn't do anything, they still must cooperate if a police officer has reason to believe they're in danger or a danger to themselves and others. They have a difficult enough job risking their lives to serve the public, and the number of officers that are killed on duty is alarming. You don't want to give an officer a reason to use force. I'd be more willing to agree with that one conservative user about the police having too much control over how society is run if they can name a single individual that was present at the Capitol building on January 6, 2021 that was wrongfully arrested. Any claim that someone was thrown in jail but was not present when the Capitol was ransacked is hysterical because those that were apprehended during and the days following the insurrection had some connection to it. The rioters had lost their First Amendment rights the instant they crossed police barricades. Some were unarmed, sure, but all of them were keen to stop votes from being counted, even if it means abducting a member of Congress. That's where the comparison between the two events falls apart. I'm not sorry to say this, but they brought this on themselves. Unlike how the DA's office in Washington, D.C. had dealt with charges connected to the insurrection, Austin County's attorney was not interested in pursuing a trespassing case against the 57 students that were arrested, so she dropped the charges. A spokesperson commented that the police lacked probable cause to arrest them for trespassing, while law enforcement and the FBI did have probable cause to arrest the suspects involved in the January 6th insurrection. Leaving the Capitol only when things got bad is not a good enough excuse to avoid prosecution because they still committed sedition and were sentenced based on what they posted on social media before the insurrection, the officers they had assaulted, and the vandalism they perpetrated on the building. Conservative activists like this user are only anti-government and anti-police if the law doesn't give them the kind of preferential treatment that Greg Abbott gave to a murderer. The student protesters value human life, while the Capitol rioters held little to no regard for it. They were willing to kill if that's what it took for Donald Trump to retain the presidency. Now that Trump has been found guilty of paying hush money to a corn actress he had an affair with, he might lose his advantage in vital swing states during his re-election bid. In case he loses the presidential election, security at the U.S. Capitol on this coming electoral college vote count should be tighter. If I was a member of Congress, I would recommend calling in the National Guard to assist the police because multiple news outlets reported at the end of May that Trump's zealots are already calling for violence against the judge and the jury that oversaw the trial. Trump reacted immediately by insisting he did nothing wrong and plans to appeal the verdict, which could take months, but his reaction may sow the seeds for a second insurrection if left unchecked by law enforcement. With negotiations of a ceasefire plan with Israel's government on the table, dispatched Gazan civilians continue to fear losing loved ones and themselves to airstrikes and gunfire from Israeli forces in Rafah. Their Israeli neighbors, likewise, are terrified that they may be captured even after the hostages, alive or dead, are freed. Prime Minister Netanyahu has kept long-term options open, but has vowed to agree to a ceasefire only if he is certain the Hamas will no longer pose a threat to Israel, and that is unlikely to happen before the ambush's first anniversary. It is important to remember that Palestine welcomed 33,400 Jewish refugees that fled Nazi Germany during World War II. They were given a sanctuary to live in, but that hospitality was exploited when the State of Israel was established. Someone dear to me that lives in Pakistan compared it to allowing a guest to stay in your house only for them to tell you, "The house is mine now," and lock you out. Presently, the longer Israeli forces remain in Gaza to combat the Hamas, the longer innocent lives would be forced to live with little to no aid. Urging the U.S. government to put pressure on Israel to enact an immediate ceasefire is a primary reason why students have been protesting at universities across the country. They weren't immediately successful, but baby steps were made. The protests have raised awareness of Netanyahu's intent to wipe Gaza off the map. An associate professor from the University of Arizona was placed on leave after he was caught cussing out a Muslim woman on camera at a smaller demonstration, and the Biden administration threatened to halt sending weapons to the Israeli government if it invaded Rafah without a plan to protect civilians. The airstrikes and the murder of Gazan women and youth showed the world that no such plan exists. The rescue of 4 more hostages is not much cause for celebration either. During that mission, 210 Palestinians were massacred, and the mainstream media was quick to sugarcoat it or leave that out altogether to persuade readers to root for the IDF like it's a sports team.
You don't like it, go back to Iran. Go back to jihad. You don't like it, go back to jihad.
You are literally...
I'm literally in your face, that's right.
You're disrespecting my religious
Why are you wearing a mask?
Like,
You're so proud. You should be happy with what you're doing. What's your what does this have to do with religion? You're spewing hate. What does this have to do with religion?
Sense of humanity.
No. Here. Yeah, who invited you here? Go back to jihad. Go.
Hate crime!
You're not working.
Hate crime! Hate crime! Right here! Cops, what are you doing? Hate crime right here!
What's the problem? You guys have an issue? What do you say about the 7th of October? You have an opinion about it? You also glorified it? You're happy about it?
They were literally
COVID or
just
the
standing here.
FBI, huh?
We're literally just
So
standing
take off the mask. You're proud. No, you're proud, no? From what? From what? For a bunch of terrorists? What do you guys...
It fills me with joy that the University of Arizona has permanently cut off ties with this xenophobic professor because his actions have stained its reputation as a welcoming environment. You guys can let me know what you think in the comments down below, provided you keep it civil because it is a delicate subject for both the right and left sides of the political spectrum. I'm going to end this video by recommending Who the F Are You?, a book written by Huda Fahmy that my younger sister got me as a Christmas present because she knew that I enjoyed reading Marjane Satrapi's autobiography Persepolis nonstop. Huda is a Muslim-American author of Egyptian descent. Her book is a semi-fictional novel based on her experiences in high school. She makes an effort to feel at home after moving to a new town by making new friends and attempting to join after-school clubs, but any initiative she takes ends up failing hilariously. An essential plot element where Huda's history teacher displays obvious Islamophobic sentiments was initially a lighthearted annoyance, but it starts to hit heavy when she assigns the class to annotate an article on why Islam is a religion of violence. A friend sitting next to Huda raises her hand and tries to argue that it's incorrect, but the teacher scolded her immediately to shut her up. On the following page, they get called to the school psychologist after a peer was caught with a device that was mistaken for a bomb and he was placed under arrest. every student of Middle Eastern descent was lined up in the hall, causing them to correctly suspect that not just the school, but the district had subjected them to racial profiling over a false accusation against a student and their demographic. Parts of Who the F Are You that cracked up my sisters were the constant puns made at Huda's expense used to split up sections of the novel, and that the teachers kept getting her name wrong. It's an engaging novel for gaining an understanding of Islamophobia from an immigrant's perspective, and it'll tickle your funny bone. Anyway, let me know what you think, and if there's any crucial details about the war and anti-Semitism at Harvard that you feel needs further discussion. Thank you if you've made it to the end, and I appreciate you. I'll see you guys in my next video. Bye.